Good afternoon, and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday series on Zoom. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis. Today, we're getting into the political weeds, and we'll examine some of the dangers that have been growing and festering among right-wing cults, aided and abetted by a complacent media and a weak Democratic Party. Our guest today is Stephen Ducat. He's the author of the book we'll be discussing, Hatreds We Love, The Psychology of Political Tribalism in Post-Truth America. His previous book, which is still in print, is called The Wimp Factor, Gender Gaps, Holy Wars, and the Politics of Anxious Masculinity. Great title. And this was the subject of his talk at Praxis Peace Institute's 2007 conference that was held in Dubrovnik, Croatia. And I also want to mention that he has a Substack page that right now is free that is called Minding Politics. Stephen Ducat is a PhD in psychology, is an author, political psychologist, psychoanalyst, and former psychology professor at the School of Humanities in the New College of California, where he taught courses in political psychology, cross-cultural psychology, and psychohistory. He received a doctorate from the Wright Institute in Berkeley and completed psychoanalytical training at the Psychoanalytical Institute of Northern California. He's also licensed to practice in California and Oregon. So welcome, Stephen. It's great to have you back with us since, I guess it was 2007.
Yeah, thank you so much, Georgia, for inviting me. It is lovely to reconnect.
Indeed, it is. I wanted to give Stephen a few minutes to talk about an overview of the book that we're going to be discussing, and I'm going to be asking questions about. So he's going to right now give you a bit of an overview before we start the Q&A. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, thank you, Georgia. I just wanted to say a couple of things. There may be people who have no familiarity with my book, wondering why I'm here, what I'm going to be talking about. My book is about the psychology of political tribalism. It's called Hatreds We Love, which sounds paradoxical. And in some ways, it is paradoxical. People do love to hate. And part of the reason for that is that hating outsiders can help us to love insiders. So there's a way in which hatred defines us and them. And so hatred and love are central emotions to political tribalism. Outgroups can sometimes function like a psychological toilet. In other words, we put into other groups those things we don't want to see in ourselves. And that helps us feel like we and our groups are just pure virtue. I use the term tribe in the kind of everyday sense of the term, which is a group that we're part of that confers a sense of belonging and identity. And generally, these are groups of people who share values, beliefs, and a real or imagined history. And I think I just want to say a little bit about how I came to this, because I've been so taken up with a question throughout my sentience in politics. As long as I've been thinking about it, I've been plagued by a single question, which is, how is it that people can act against their own self-interest? It has always puzzled me. It informed the past books I wrote, the courses I taught, and so on. I just couldn't understand, in particular, how people could be so willing to elect politicians whose policies rendered their lives poorer, less free, sicker, and shorter. And something about the rise of Donald Trump in 2016 that was a kind of light bulb that went off in my head. And I realized that that there are self-interests more powerful than economics, and sometimes even life itself. And that is our membership in groups, which gives us a sense of meaning and identity, and that people will kill and die for that identity. And so that, in a bumper sticker, a little more than a bumper sticker, is the focus of my book and why I've been so interested in the issue of tribalism.
Okay. All right. I'd like to pose the first question, which is something you mentioned in your book, and I love the way you framed it. You called the Democratic Party's penchant for equality you labeled as preemptive submission. So I'd like you to tell us about this disability and how it has lost Democrats' elections, crippled much of their legislation, and prevented Trump from really being held accountable for the criminal things that he has done, including, I would say, treason or sedition. So one section in your book is titled The Democratic Party's Historical Role as GOP Enabler, and that voters want to see someone kick ass on their behalf. And do you see signs of this changing with the Harris-Walz campaign?
Well, I do see signs of it changing, but let me say a little bit about what it is that's changing,
Great.
what it is that needed to change. So, well, in some ways, the Democratic Party and its disabilities, if you will, is an issue peripheral to the focus of my book, but it became central in trying to understand how Trump rose to power. That it wasn't simply the synergistic match between his pathology and the vulnerabilities of his followers, but it had a lot to do with the failure of what is now the country's only pro-democracy party. And Democrats as a party have shown a profound timidity in both the content of their policies and in how they talk about them. So, and I'm speaking mostly of party leaders here, but there's been a kind of collective psychology that, in my view, has been quite hobbling, which is a kind of conflict avoidance that, in my view, is steeped in a fear of their own aggression. Democrats want to avoid being like Republicans, swaggering bullies obsessed with domination. And until recently, they really haven't been able to mobilize aggression in the service of mutuality, democracy, and freedom. And they've tended to engage in what I describe as this preemptive submission. And what I mean by that is giving in to perceived GOP demands before even engaging in tough negotiations. And I think what the Harris-Walz campaign is demonstrating is that aggression can be coupled with humor, and that is a powerful alternative to the bigoted and infantile attacks by the MAGA forces. Mocking has always been a vital tool in dealing with the bloviating baby men that rule or want to rule as dictators. Leaders like Trump spend so much of their time pumping themselves up that they live in terror of being deflated. And that's really what we should do. We should deflate them. And that's one of the reasons I don't like using the word strongman to describe an autocrat, because in fact, they are weak. They're unpopular and brittle. And that's why they have to rely on violent repression to stay in power. So, I could say, more about that, more about what I think some of the Democratic Party's failures have been, especially in framing policy issues. But, perhaps, you have something to add or a direction you want to take this.
Well, one thing I wanted to bring up, and I think this might be the time to do it, is what type of people are most vulnerable to the conspiracy thinking that we see associated with the MAGA group and the kind of delusions that they play into. And again, do what you mentioned before, is that they vote against their own interests. Who are the people most vulnerable to this, and why?
Well, I, use the term post-truth in the title of my book. It's not a term I invented, but I like it because post-truth is not simply about lying, but it's an attempt to undermine the very notion of truth, that experts can be trusted, facts can be disentangled from fiction, and that truth is even knowable or matters. And so if truth is unknowable, then that leaves room for the leader to define reality. And And so I think that this is something that has risen, especially on the right. And conspiracy theories are very central to post-truth, especially conservative post-truth. And I want to preface, whatever I say about a conspiracy theory with a recognition that there are real world conspiracies. However, the difference between conspiracy thinking and a conspiracy theory is evidence. An actual conspiracy has evidence that you can point to.
Like
So what?
Like Watergate.
Like Watergate. Yeah. I mean, there are so many of them out there that we've lived through. The Iran-Contra scandal, efforts to get politicians to push legislation written by corporations. I mean, these are things that are real, and in some ways they happen out in the open. But then there are conspiracy theories for which there is no evidence, a kind of faith-based thinking, if you will. And one of the things I was very interested in is who is particularly susceptible to conspiracy thinking. And there's actually been research about this that looks at the particular groups, and high on the list are religious fundamentalists, especially Christian fundamentalists, viewers of right-wing media, Trump supporters, people who feel very little control over their lives, and those who are socially isolated. And those who are the least susceptible to believing them include liberals and atheists. So, there's a way in which a religious belief system, and I'm sure I'm going to offend religious people in the audience, but there's something about a religious belief system, especially a fundamentalist one, that trains people to rely on faith and to minimize, if not dismiss, evidence. So it isn't so surprising how well that translates into another kind of evidence-free belief system, that is adopted by, currently the MAGA cult.
One thing I was going to ask later, but I see it's connected to what you're just talking about. And this was something you mentioned, the politics of nihilism, and that Steve Bannon is kind of an expert at this in creating so much noise and disorder that nothing gets through, and people give up on politics and think it's all corrupt and there's no point in engaging at all. So they say, we're not going to vote. So I'd like you to speak a little bit about that, and also, again, if you think the Harris-Walz campaign is able to disrupt this cacophony and actually get people excited again.
Yeah. Well, I think the way I see it, there are sort of two aspects to the politics of nihilism. One is epistemological, how we know what's true, and the practical. Epistemological nihilism is, in a way, another way of referring to post-truth. It goes beyond the assertion of falsehoods and conspiracy theories, but it's grounded in the notion that truth no longer matters. It's the reductio ad absurdum of relativism. There are, from this perspective, there are so many claims about reality that we can never really know what's true. Everything is subjective anyway. Evidence doesn't matter. We're better off letting the leader decide and adopting the beliefs that best serve our group or our tribe. So that's, the kind of epistemological nihilism, which in a way sets the ground for the political nihilism. The political nihilism, the practical nihilism, is the belief that our current institutions and leaders are totally corrupt, and there's nothing that can be done about it. And in fact, the best leaders are those who have the smarts and power to get away with it. And so here we see this is connected to the kind of inversion in public opinion among MAGA followers, that with every conviction and every defiance of law, Trump, among his base, grows in popularity. And in this perspective, in this practical nihilism, institutions like those that oversee elections or ensure the rule of law, they can't be reformed or modified. They have to be burned to the ground, and then we can start over. And they have it out for us. They want to persecute us, and so what's required in the Bannonite, perspective, might be the literal incineration of buildings and other infrastructure, or even the mass murder of whichever is the demonized group of the day. So you can see this expressed in various online troll armies that can easily devolve into lynch mobs, as we saw on January 6th, and the kind of mobs that are currently convulsing the UK. And so I'm going to lead to what I think the Harris-Walz campaign how it can be helpful. And that is by addressing what I think is one of the root causes of this political nihilism, which is despair. Despair about one's own prospects for thriving and those of one's family, and over the rampant and increasing normalization of corruption. Everybody's corrupt. Everybody does it. The most important thing is to be good at it. So I think where the Harris-Walz campaign can, and in some ways already has countered that despair, is in a number of ways. And they have done it by pushing back against an aspiring autocrat, in this case, Trump, by publicizing his self-serving criminality, making fun of it, siding unambiguously with ordinary Americans against the unaccountable welfare power of the wealthy. And this is, of course, in sharp contrast with the faux populism of MAGA. I mean, and here we're getting to sort of the kernel of truth of nihilistic despair. The system really is rigged in some ways, but it's not rigged secretively. It's rigged out in the open. And by calling attention to that, by acknowledging it, people can be more targeted in their cynicism, if you will. So I think in addition to that, the Harris-Walz campaign also speaks in a way that makes it clear that they're the protectors of freedom. Mm-hmm. And they're also defining freedom. In the book I talk about the differences between kind of right-wing notions of freedom and more liberal notions of freedom. That famous saying that the freedom to swing your fist ends at my nose. Well, conservatives for hundreds of years have sided with a fist. Right. And I think what the Harris-Walz campaign is doing is making it clear they side with your nose. Right. And they also have made a powerful case for reality-based optimism and manifesting a politics of joy that doesn't involve deluding yourself about the difficulties of the world, but facing it head on.
Yeah, very, very well put. And I want to go now to something that you wrote quite a bit about, because all of us are probably knowing people in this demographic. You talked about libertarianism and the dangers of it. And you just alluded to it now, that we know, I think several of us know people who are RFK Jr. supporters. Not many of them, but I certainly have friends on Facebook who are. They're anti-vax. Some are also anti-mask. And it's part of the new age wellness community. They consider themselves politically astute. Most of them are not, but they follow politics. Yeah. But this danger has really seeped into the new age wellness community through COVID. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that and maybe tell us, how do we talk to these people to make sense to them?
That is one of the biggest challenges. I think in many ways, new age apostles of post-truth are kind of simply right-wing libertarians with a spiritual gloss. Mm. They tout the virtues of a healthy diet that seem unconcerned about whether anyone else can eat. They live in this solipsistic universe and believe they create their own reality. And of course, there are belief systems that seem to confirm that for them. I don't know if you've ever heard of Derek Beers, but he and a couple of other folks have a podcast and a book called Conspirituality. And that notion, conspirituality, is a belief system that is kind of a fusion of conspiracy thinking with bastardized and self-justifying spiritual notions that seem to sanctify narrow individualism. And I talk about that in my book, especially with regard to the COVID crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And one core feature of that conspirituality is what some people have called sovereign immunity. And this is a belief that our immune systems can function like an impenetrable fortress. What comes in or goes out of our bodies is determined solely by our will. It positions itself in defiance of public health, both in terms of science and practice. So it dismisses germ theory. It rejects vaccination, masking, social distancing, and the organizing delusion is that we're not linked by a shared microbial ecology. Instead, what we are disconnected monads that only choose to be affected by others. And that in addition, so I think we can see in this fantasy of our immune system as a libertarian being, if you will, the projection onto immunology of bourgeois individualism or narrow individualism, that we are disconnected monads and our immune system reflects that. And so part of what ties the conspirituality community is a set of conspiracy theories. Mm-hmm. And here is where there's a lot of overlap with the MAGA cult. There are powerful, malevolent agents of the deep state and big pharma. Not that there isn't a big pharma, but they have a kind of a delusional understanding of it. And these forces want to deprive people of their so-called medical freedom by implanting microchips along with vaccinations. Those who refuse will be rounded up by FEMA stormtroopers and sent to special internment camps. And so, this is very interesting, this idea of medical freedom. This has emerged, this is a term of art in the anti-vax world. But I think we can see in that the same kind of right-wing notions of freedom to harm that has characterized conservative thinking for a long time. In other words, I am free to infect you by not wearing a mask, but you are not free from getting infected. Mm-hmm. And so it's another iteration of that.
Yes.
And so we might wonder, well, how did this come to pass? How did a community, let's say, the New Age community, speaking very broadly, collapsing all kinds of differences, how did this community come to embrace health that embraced health, well-being, and loving one another? How did it get sucked down this particular rabbit hole? And as somebody, you didn't mention it in the introduction, but I was someone who practiced as a naturopathic doctor. I kind of put it on hold for the moment in order to write, but so I practice as a naturopathic doctor as well as a psychologist. So I've had a close-up view of the credulity of some of my colleagues. Things are changing now, and evidence-based criteria are increasingly seen as foundational to most naturopathic treatments. But that is a work in progress, and change is slow. And way too many times, clinical approaches have been taught and adopted based solely on the anecdotal reports of charismatic teachers. Mm-hmm. And I think we've seen the same dynamics operate in the alternative medicine world more broadly. healing approaches and New Age spiritual beliefs have too often been solely faith-based enterprises with little interest, if not rejection, of science. And so when you practice that way, you're practicing thinking and acting without evidence.
Mhm.
And in my book, I describe, all these, we talked earlier about the different kinds of people who are drawn to conspiracy thinking. And conspiracy thinking is, in a sense, the opposite of critical thinking. I define critical thinking as the ability to evaluate, use, and care about evidence. These are rejected. They're rejected by Christian fundamentalists and New Age anti-vaxxers.
Right.
And so this calls up the obvious question. How do we invite people who are lost to conspiracy thinking back into our world? Whether they're the dreadlock New Ager or the camouflage wearing militia member. How do we make consensual reality something that we can share with them? And so I think, first of all, we have to resist the temptation to pummel them with facts. While there is certainly a place for fact checking, it's vitally important, but it isn't enough. And when we're talking about conspiracy beliefs, whether it's about COVID or anything else, we're talking about what psychologists call identity protective cognition. These are things in which they're not just ideas, but they're ideas that affirm who we are and affirm our place in the tribe. And so there's a lot at stake. And if you prematurely and crudely challenge those ideas, people will double down and they will defend against that threat. And because it feels dangerous to them. And, one of the paradoxical findings of researchers about conspiracy thinking is that the people who are the most dug in on various conspiracy theories are people with expertise in the area. Now, I think that's completely bizarre. But the reason for that is that, let's say you're talking about climate change to somebody who knows something about climate and physics. What happens is their identity is based on climate denial, but they use their knowledge of science to shore up their delusions, to more effectively protect themselves from the threatening truth. So what do you do? Well, the first, excuse me, the first step is deep listening, not just to the conspiracy story, but to the fears and longings behind the story. So what problems, what questions does the delusional tale solve for them? And of course, to even get to the point of listening, you have to not be trying to convert them to reality. You have to be genuinely curious. So deep listening, informed by curiosity, and fueled by empathy and compassion. So in some ways, this is like the way an psychoanalyst listens to the dream of a patient. You don't want to get too hung up on the manifest content. Instead, you want to listen for the feelings and the fantasies that the dream narrative might be a symbolic stand-in for. And so the long-term strategy here is to build a rapport and their sense of being respected and understood. And eventually, hopefully, that rapport can allow you gradually to introduce a fact-based version of events. But here is where it gets tricky. I'm going to drink some water here. The way that people think about issues, whether they're conspiracy theories or events in the world, the way they make moral judgments about them is through what social scientists call moral intuitions. And conservatives and liberals tend to reason with very different unconscious moral intuitions. So conservatives are driven by a need for purity, sanctity, respect for traditional authority, personal freedom, and loyalty. And so if you want to get through to a conservative about an issue, let's say climate change, you have to talk to them using the metaphors of their moral intuition, which is talking about purity, about the sacredness of the planet, the ways in which attending to it will enhance their freedom, and so on. Those are some of my thoughts about how you would approach people like that. You know, it's not easy. There's not a formula. There's not a 10 steps to doing that. But I think these are some of the themes that are involved in reaching them if we're going to.
And it takes a lot of patience.
A lot of patience.
A
Yeah.
lot of patience. I'm not sure that I'd be good at it. But I have one last question before I open it up that I want to ask, because I think it's something that, you know, we don't know much about, but I'm sure everyone would like to hear this. You talk in your book about the 3/5 compromise that was in the southern states, and how that, I would like you to talk about how that what the 3/5 compromise is and how it relates to the creation of the Electoral College.
Ooh, boy. Well, that is something I wish I had researched in more detail. But a 3/5 compromise is essentially a way for that happened in the antebellum period in the U.S. I am not a historian, so I apologize to those with that expertise in the audience who could probably answer this question better than I. But it was a way, it was a kind of a compromise between denying the humanity of Africans who were enslaved and acknowledging it so that their bodies could be counted in political representation. And so, you know, that this contributed to the way in which electoral votes were counted. And so you have states with very low populations who nevertheless have a disproportionate amount of power. I think that, you know, I probably shouldn't say any more about it, but I think it was a compromise with quotes. It was an attempt to both deny and acknowledge the humanity of enslaved Africans in a way that redounded to the political benefit of the South.
So the 3/5, was that what they counted the slaves as 3/5 of a person?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And
Yeah.
so even though those 3/5 of a person couldn't vote, their owners could use that 3/5 of a person as a vote.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was a way in which, I mean, you could think of it as the political version of their extracted labor. You know, so they not only the slave owners not only extracted value out of the slave that was unpaid, they also extracted a kind of political profit from their bodies
Yeah,
that they couldn't benefit from.
right. Kind of unbelievable, but this is where our electoral college came out of too, but basically to benefit rural communities and at the disadvantage of the majority of the cities. So
yeah, there are all kinds of mechanisms in which we bless minority rule.
right, which has been a tragedy for our country.
Yeah.
So I'm going to now open it up for people who'd like to ask questions. I think we've gotten into some pretty deep things here. It might take a minute or so to get. Okay, Katie, you want to unmute?
Thank you, Stephen. Very, very tight presentation. My head's spinning. I'm in the field of psychology, a psychotherapist, and just wrote a book also with some parallels here. not exactly up to your intellectual capacity, but pretty interesting stuff, I think. So, okay, here's my question, and then I'll come back to other questions if there's time. So, you talk about what I'm interpreting with the title of the wimp factor, which I think is fabulous title. You talk about in the early part of your presentation today, so the strong man archetype, the strong man, the guy that's identified with that is he's identified with that because he's projecting, he's borrowing an identity from somebody else. That's part of what I heard you say, and what I was thinking about was Brian Closs, his work in Corruptible, about how his belief is that the idea of the domination person is identified with needing to dominate and be the big gorilla because of ancient anthropological identification that is so deep in us. You probably know what I'm talking about. So would you comment on that? Yeah.
Yes. Well, so just to be clear, the wimp factor is my previous book, and
I'm sorry.
But there's some theme. I pick up the themes of that book, which is how men's fear of the feminine informs their political behavior, and I kind of update it in my current book, which is called Hatreds We Love. That's the book on political tribalism.
Okay.
But so what's so interesting about conventional masculinity and the way it informs domination is that it's defined as domination, as having power over others. But the interesting thing about that is that that's very unstable. If your sense of self is based on having power over other people, of having your boot on their neck, that is an unstable condition. So in order to keep the sense of being powerful and superior, you have to keep your boot on their neck, and you need all kinds of mechanisms of repression to do that. So in other words, that being a dictator is a very unstable condition because it requires constant repression. And so that's part of the reason I don't like using strongman, because strongman is how they want to see themselves. But in fact, they're very weak. They're very fragile. And I think we can see that in Donald Trump, how thin-skinned he is, how little slights just are so wounding to him. And that's where he sheds his tough guy persona.
Yeah, it's like a 2-year-old acting out. So Mike, you have your hand up?
Thanks. Just if you could go back for a second on that, I've always been fascinated by the whole electoral college thing. And when you and George were talking about it, I mean, I'm missing something there. So, and how it ties in with today is the second part of that. But so if the black people got 3/5 of a vote.
They didn't get 3/5 of a vote.
But they couldn't vote.
They couldn't vote. So their bodies were counted.
How does the owner get, I don't understand how the owner.
So the enslaved African was counted as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of political representation for the white property people that could vote. They didn't get any voting rights, but their bodies conferred voting rights to the people who controlled them, if you will. Does that make any sense?
And then how does that tie into the electoral college? So the way it's so weird today?
Well, I think there are all kinds of. So part of what the Republican Party has now stands for is minority rule. They don't believe in democracy. They think that a minority of the powerful and the bigoted should rule. And so that's what they want. They want to end elections. They've been really open about that. But that's not really new. That tendency to privilege a minority over the will of the majority has been around in the US since at least the 19th century. And so there are, a variety of different mechanisms for that. Like the Electoral College, where a small number of people, let's say the people in Wyoming, so voters in Wyoming have a powerfully disproportionately greater say in what happens. Their vote counts more than people in California. Now, so this is only connected to the 3/5 compromise in that it's just, there are all these different versions of policies that enshrine minority rule. So for Democrats to get elected, they can't rely on just a majority. They have to have an overwhelming majority, because the way that geographical tribalism works is that in the small, the low populated rural areas, those people have a lot more voice than those of us in the cities. And they tend to be much more conservative, and they tend to be Republicans. So the system really is rigged, but it's rigged not in a secret conspiratorial way, but in an open structural way. So
Right.
I hope that answers your question somewhat.
Yeah, great. Bob, you have your hand up?
Yeah, there's a little simpler answer to Mike's question. The 3/5 of a person added to the population. The South wanted to count all of their slaves as population to establish representation, and the Congress said, no, we'll only count them 3/5. I think Stephen said use a language that was kind of a compromise of discounting them and counting them at the same time. So the Electoral College then was formed because it could aggregate that total population and give each state an amount of representation based upon population.
Yeah.
And so that's what we have now. That's the simple answer to how
Yeah,
it
well, I
gets started.
appreciate that. Yeah, I appreciate your clarification there. Thank you.
Yeah, I knew somebody on this call would be into that. Probably Ben is too, but he's probably on a phone. Anyone else have a question they want to or comment? Okay, Katie, we can go back to you.
Thanks. So what I heard you say, Stephen, was that the way to work with this kind of thinking, the conspiracy people, the mega right, whatever tribal group we're talking about, is to have patience, to have empathy, to be one-on-one with them. It assumes that you're going to be one-on-one with these people, which of course as therapists we know we can do sometimes. But in general, these groups are hugely violent often, and in large grouping. So how would you say there could be any healing work done there?
Well, I don't think you can approach a marauding mob and calmly get their story and express your empathy and compassion. You have to flee and protect yourself from them. So I'm speaking in the broadest, most general way about what approach you would make, and I am not that patient with people outside of the consulting room. I mean, I will meet people halfway, but I am there. But I think we can make use of some of the research that shows how you can get through to people. And some of the research is actually really interesting and encouraging. For example, I'll just give you one example. There's a study done where they took conservatives and liberals, and they set up this situation where they tried to persuade a conservative group of subjects to vote for a hypothetical liberal candidate. And there are two ways they tried to do that. One was by moderating the liberal position, making it weaker. That's the approach of the Democrats traditionally. But they tried another approach, which is not to moderate the position or weaken their demands, but to frame the issue in the moral intuitions of the conservative subjects. And that got through to them much more powerfully.
Interesting. Anyone else? If not, we will end the program, but I have a feeling somebody wants to say something.
I'll make a comment. Whoop.
Go ahead.
I'll make a comment. Early in the session, we talked about people voting against their self-interest. When I've tried to communicate with some of the MAGA people, I've found that I've not found one yet that believes that person is voting against their own self-interest. They believe they're voting for their own self-interest.
Right. I agree. And that's one of the one of my epiphanies around this issue is that I came to realize how naive my notion of, and limited my notion of self-interest was, which is, in terms of economics, are you, do you have health insurance? Are you getting paid less? Do you live in a world, polluted and dangerous as a result of corporate deregulation? All those kinds of things. Those issues are far more secondary than people's membership in groups that they value. In other words, it's political tribalism that is their membership in groups is how people define their self-interest, which is why people are willing to die and kill for the group. So I changed my notion, my understanding of what it meant to act in one's self-interest, because I had at least initially a very limited notion of what self-interest was. But you're absolutely right. They think they're acting in their self-interest. And they also tell themselves stories about things like economics. There's a study done when Trump first came into power after the 2016 elections, and it was on attitudes towards the economy. So they took a group of subjects, like Republican voters, and they asked them how the economy was, like 2 weeks before Trump was elected. And they said it was terrible. The economy was awful. 2 weeks after he got into power, their opinion was the economy was great. Fantastic. I feel so much optimism, things are so much better. Well, obviously nothing changed in those 4 weeks in the economy, but the tribe that gets credit or blame, that's what changed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was something that you brought up in the book too, which I think is very interesting. One last thing, if we don't have someone else, that I wanted to mention was the role of the media. And often this whole idea of giving both sides equal time, or saying that there's the right-wing extreme and the left-wing extreme, and there is no left-wing extreme in the US.
Yeah, I mean, it's absurd.
We don't have a marauding communists with guns in the street.
Yeah.
Trying to overthrow the government. And that would be the extreme equivalent of what we've got on the right.
Yeah.
And that's that missing piece in the media where they equate kind of a middle of the road left with an extreme right is very disturbing to me. And do you have a way of looking at this, or how do we get through to the media on it? It's just so...
Well, I think they are getting it gradually. And, one of the things we all witnessed was how reluctant reporters were to call Trump's lies lies.
Right.
They tried all kinds of euphemisms, like he didn't fully represent empirical reality. It wasn't utterly factual. There are some things that were left out. Eventually that gave way because of the weight of the lies, which we all know about, we all witnessed. And so I think that notion, that false equivalence, is beginning to erode, but it poses a real problem for journalists, because you can't be objective and unbiased anymore. These two things used to be the same, but now they're not. If you are a reporter, you have to be biased towards what's true. Well, if one side in a political debate relies on lies and conspiracy theories, then you can't embrace both sides. You can't be unbiased. If you're unbiased towards the truth, then you're not objective. So there's this tension between being objective and being unbiased. And, that's part of what's changed in journalism.
Yeah, this has been fascinating to watch. I will let Katie have a last question and then we will finish.
Sure.
Katie? You're mute.
So, okay.
Only one, Katie.
Okay, where, do you know where you got the study about moral intuition? Do you know where that came from?
Yeah, it's cited in my book. So, you know, I have I have references to pretty much all the studies that I cite.
Okay.
But a number of people, have kind of developed the concept of moral intuitions and the way it differs by, you know, partisan identity, and then other people have applied it to experimental situations like the one I mentioned. So if you go to my book and you look it up, and there should be references there that you can follow.
Yeah, this is an incredible book. Hatreds We Love, The Psychology of Political Tribalism in Post-Truth America. And there's lots of pages of citations and research that's been done to create this book. So it's really an important book to have for all of us politicos. And pretty much all of us are politicos. So I want to thank you, Stephen, so much for your presence with us today and your brilliant answers and knowledge of what we're up against in these elections and the political climate we live in today. So thank you so much.
Well, I am very honored by your interest, and I know that it's a complex set of ideas, and I've been trying to unpack this puzzle since at least 2016. It's been an obsession of mine, and I guess it will continue to be for a while. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again. I'm going to